The man everyone stopped noticing. The first person to notice the lights was the milk delivery driver. Every morning at 4:47, long before the city woke, he followed the same route along the old industrial district near the river. Most buildings there sat empty now. The machine shop had closed years ago. The feed warehouse was covered in rust. The rail yard handled only a fraction of the freight it once had. Nothing ever changed. That was why the light caught his attention. A warm amber glow spilled through the dusty windows of a small workshop tucked between a brick storage building and an abandoned loading dock. The sign above the door hung crooked: Mercer Carpentry and Joinery. The driver slowed his truck. For a moment, he thought he might be mistaken. Then he saw movement behind the glass. Someone was working. At nearly 5 in the morning, again. The next day, the light was there, and the day after that. Then people began noticing other things. Large stacks of hardwood appeared behind the workshop. Not construction-grade lumber, not cheap material. The kind of wood craftsmen spent months searching for. White oak, black walnut, ash. Long boards wrapped carefully against the weather. A delivery truck arrived one morning carrying timber longer than anything Elias Mercer had used in years. The driver asked where he wanted it unloaded. Elias pointed silently toward the rear lot. No explanation, no conversation, just work. That was how most people remembered him. Quiet, polite, difficult to know. At 74 years old, Elias had become one of those people who blended into the background of a city. Not because he lacked importance, because familiarity had made him invisible. Everyone knew who he was, which meant almost nobody really saw him anymore. For decades, his hands had helped build parts of the town people used every day without thinking. Porches, staircases, storefront interiors, church pews, fishing docks, window frames, school renovations. The evidence of his work was everywhere, but the man himself had slowly disappeared from public attention. New construction companies arrived. Modern materials replaced old methods. People wanted speed, efficiency, lower costs. Few cared about traditional joinery anymore. Fewer still understood it. Elias never complained. He simply kept working. The workshop reflected that attitude. Inside, time moved differently. Old hand tools hung neatly on worn walls. Planes polished smooth from decades of use. Chisels sharpened so carefully they could shave paper. Wooden measuring gauges made by craftsmen long dead. The building smelled of cedar, linseed oil, and sawdust embedded deep into the floorboards. Some mornings, Elias stood motionless inside before beginning work, not resting, listening. The workshop creaked differently depending on the weather. He had learned its sounds the way sailors learn tides. Outside, rain tapped against the roof. Inside, the silence settled around him like an old coat. He placed a blueprint tube onto the workbench, slowly, carefully, as though afraid the paper inside might tear. For several moments he simply stared at it. Then he unrolled the first sheet. The edges were yellowed with age, creases cut across faded lines. There were handwritten notes in the margins, measurements, corrections, dates, a few words almost worn away completely. Elias ran his fingers lightly over the page. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Then he went back to work. Weeks passed. Curiosity spread. The workshop became a topic of conversation in diners and barbershops. Nobody knew what Elias was building. Everyone had a theory. "It's a boat," one man insisted. "Too much hardwood." "No, it's furniture. Furniture doesn't need beams that size. Maybe he's restoring something." Restoring what? Nobody had an answer. What made the mystery stranger was that no one ever saw finished pieces leave the shop. Materials went in, nothing came out. The project seemed to be growing entirely inside the building, as though whatever Elias was making was too large to move once completed. One afternoon, 16-year-old Maya Bennett stopped outside the workshop while riding her bicycle home from school. She worked part-time for the local newspaper, mostly small assignments, community events, school sports, minor stories nobody else wanted. She had heard the rumors. Truthfully, she expected nothing interesting, just another old craftsman working on a personal project. But as she passed the side window, she noticed something unusual. Large wooden arches, not furniture, not cabinetry, structural components, massive ones, Each piece was marked with precise numbering, every joint fitted with extraordinary detail. Maya slowed her bicycle. Inside, Elias was studying a blueprint spread across a work table. Even through the dusty glass, she could see how intensely focused he was, like a man solving a problem only he understood. Then something happened. A gust of wind pushed the workshop door partially open, for only a second, but it was enough. Maya caught a glimpse of dozens of rolled plans stacked against the wall, far more than a normal project would require. The door closed again. The moment passed, yet the image stayed with her. Something about it felt important. That evening, she mentioned it to her editor. The editor laughed. Maybe the old Carpenter's building a castle. Maya smiled politely, but she couldn't stop thinking about those plans, or the scale of the structure hidden inside. The following week, she visited the city archives while researching an unrelated assignment. Rows of filing cabinets filled the basement. Dust drifted beneath fluorescent lights. Most records hadn't been touched in years. While searching for property maps, she came across an old permit listing. The address caught her attention immediately. Mercer Carpentry and Joinery, the workshop. The document dated back nearly 40 years. Attached references pointed toward another file, then another. Curiosity turned into investigation. Within an hour, she had assembled a small stack of records. Most contained routine construction information, contracts, invoices, planning documents. Nothing remarkable. Then she found a folder with several pages missing. The title read, Riverside Connector Development Project, 1986. Large sections had been removed or misplaced, yet one surviving photograph remained. Maya stared at it. A group of workers stood beside an unfinished construction site near the river. Most faces meant nothing to her, except one, a much younger Elias Mercer, standing beside another man roughly the same age, both smiling, both covered in sawdust. Behind them stood the early framework of something large, something unfinished. Written on the back of the photograph was a single note. Project suspended following incident. Further development canceled. No explanation, no details. Just that. Canceled. Maya looked back at the photograph, then at the workshop address, then at the missing pages. Outside the archive windows, rain began striking the glass. A distant roll of thunder crossed the city. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt the first real tug of a story. Not a construction project, not a retirement hobby, something older, something unfinished, something that had waited a very long time. And across town, as darkness settled over the riverfront, Elias Mercer locked his workshop and loaded several wooden templates into the back of his truck. Instead of driving home, he headed toward a fenced section of abandoned waterfront land that most residents had forgotten even existed. The rain fell harder, his headlights disappeared into the darkness, and by sunrise, fresh survey markings would appear on ground where no new construction had been approved in nearly 4 decades. The secret buried under the riverfront. The survey markings appeared overnight. By sunrise, people were already gathering behind the chain-link fence along the abandoned riverfront. The site had been untouched for decades. Most residents barely remembered it existed. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete. Rusted guardrails leaned toward the water. Old pilings stood like broken teeth along the riverbank, reminders of projects that had never been finished. Yet now bright orange stakes stretched across the property in straight, deliberate lines. Someone had measured everything. Someone knew exactly where each mark belonged, and everyone knew who that someone was. The rumor spread through the city faster than the morning traffic. By lunchtime, photos of the site had appeared on community pages. Local radio hosts debated theories. Retired construction workers stopped by to examine the markings for themselves. None of them could make sense of it. The layout was too large for a private project, too precise for a hobby, and too expensive for a man who worked alone. Meanwhile, Elias Mercer returned to his workshop and continued working as though none of the attention existed. The rhythmic sound of chisels echoed through the building. Sawdust gathered around his boots. The old radio on a shelf hummed softly between stations. Outside, people speculated. Inside, he kept building. Days later, the first major section arrived at the riverfront. It happened before dawn. Several flatbed trucks rolled through the gates carrying enormous timber assemblies wrapped beneath protective covers. Residents who happened to be awake watched from parked cars. By sunrise, cranes had begun lifting the structures into place. The shape emerging from the site only deepened the mystery. Massive curved beams, heavy support sections, complex joinery unlike anything seen in modern construction. People expected steel. Instead, they found craftsmanship, the kind almost nobody practiced anymore. The city administration finally took notice. At a weekly council meeting, officials reviewed records. No permit, no active development authorization, no approved municipal project. Nothing. The site should have remained dormant, yet construction was clearly underway. Questions began arriving faster than answers. Who was funding it? Who owned the materials? Why had nobody reported the activity sooner? Most importantly, what exactly was being built? While city officials searched for explanations, Maya Bennett returned to the archives. The photographs she had discovered days earlier refused to leave her thoughts. She wanted to know what had happened to the project from 1986. Unfortunately, much of the file was missing. Entire sections had vanished. Accident reports, planning notes, financial records, gone. But archives have a way of hiding stories in unexpected places. One clue led to another. An engineering report referenced a subcontractor. The subcontractor led to newspaper clippings. The clippings led to storage boxes containing records from a local construction union. Hour after hour, Maya assembled fragments. Slowly, a forgotten story emerged. In the mid-1980s, city planners proposed an ambitious project along the river. Two neighborhoods sat on opposite sides. One side thrived, the other struggled. Businesses closed, investment disappeared, jobs became harder to find. Residents had long argued that the river itself contributed to the divide. Crossing between communities required a lengthy detour. The proposed solution was simple: a pedestrian bridge. Not massive, not expensive, just enough to reconnect people. The project generated enthusiasm throughout both neighborhoods. Local tradesmen volunteered expertise. Community groups raised support. Small business owners contributed resources. The bridge became more than infrastructure. It became a symbol. Then everything changed. Maya eventually found the article, a single newspaper clipping tucked inside an unrelated folder. The headline was small, barely noticeable. A workplace accident during preliminary construction had claimed the life of a carpenter named Thomas Hale. The project halted immediately afterward. Funding collapsed. Political priorities shifted. Within months, the bridge disappeared from public discussion. The neighborhoods remained separated. Life moved on. Except perhaps for one person. Maya studied the accompanying photograph. There he was again, a younger Elias Mercer, standing beside Thomas Hale. The same photograph she had already seen, only this version included a full caption. The two men weren't ordinary workers. They were project leads, partners, friends. She sat quietly beneath the archive lights. For weeks, she had wondered why an elderly carpenter would suddenly begin such an enormous undertaking. Now she had a possible answer. Not ambition, not profit. Memory. The next day, she visited several retired tradesmen who had worked in the city during that era. Most remembered Thomas Hale immediately. A few smiled when hearing his name. One old welder leaned back in his chair and stared out the window for several seconds before speaking. Tom and Elias were always together. What were they like? Maya asked. The man chuckled softly. Different. How? Tom could walk into a room and make friends with everybody. And Elias? The welder smiled. He'd spend an hour listening before saying 10 words. He paused. But when he did speak, people listened. Over the following days, similar stories emerged. Everyone described the friendship, the partnership, the shared dream of building things meant to last. The bridge had been one of those dreams. Then Maya uncovered something unexpected. The previous user assistant messages contain text audio that has already been spoken. Ensure that the audio continues naturally and matches the tone, style, and speed of the words in the previous assistant audio. Do not repeat previous messages. For context, here is the full text. The following user messages will contain chunks of this text. Say the following text out loud, going quickly word by word, exactly as written. The thing he was really building. The envelope changed everything. For nearly a week, nobody outside city offices knew what it contained. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the documents proved the construction was legal. Others believed they revealed a decades-old agreement hidden from the public. Every coffee shop conversation seemed to circle back to the same question. What had Elias Mercer been carrying all these years? The answer emerged gradually, and when it did, it transformed the city's understanding of the quiet carpenter they thought they knew. The documents were not permits. They were something far more personal. Inside the envelope were letters, meeting records, sketches, photographs, and handwritten commitments dating back more than 40 years. Many had been signed by residents from both sides of the river: teachers, factory workers, shop owners, mechanics, dock laborers, retirees, young parents, ordinary people. Together they had created what they called a community covenant, not a legal contract, not a government document, a promise, a collective pledge stating that the bridge would one day be completed, no matter how long it took. Most people who signed it never lived to see that day, but Elias had preserved every page, every signature, every note, for 4 decades. City officials discovered something else. Over the years, Elias had quietly contributed a portion of nearly every paycheck into a private fund dedicated to the project. Not enough to build a bridge all at once, but enough to keep the dream alive. Year after year, job after job, while other people saved for vacations, larger homes, or retirement plans, Elias saved for something nobody else believed would ever exist. The realization spread through the city with a strange mixture of admiration and disbelief. The bridge was not the work of a wealthy donor, nor a government initiative, nor a corporate investment. It was the result of one craftsman refusing to abandon a promise. Yet the greatest surprise was still hidden within the structure itself. As construction entered its final phase, city leaders were invited to tour the site. Maya Bennett received permission to attend as well. The morning was clear and unusually warm. Sunlight shimmered across the river. The bridge now stretched gracefully between the two neighborhoods, its timber arches rising above the water with a quiet elegance that felt timeless. Nothing about it appeared flashy. Nothing demanded attention. Its beauty came from proportion, detail, and craftsmanship. As the group crossed a temporary walkway, Elias guided them toward the center span. He moved slowly. The arthritis in his hands had worsened over recent months. The long days had taken a visible toll on him, yet his focus never wavered. When they reached the midpoint, he stopped beside one of the bridge's interior panels. "Look closely," he said. The officials leaned forward. At first they saw only intricate woodwork. Then details emerged. Names, hundreds of names, carved directly into the timber, rows upon rows of them, each accompanied by brief inscriptions. A teacher who had spent 30 years helping local children learn to read, a mechanic who repaired emergency vehicles during winter storms, a nurse who worked double shifts through difficult years, a fisherman who organized food drives when factories closed. Stories hidden within the structure itself, lives woven into the bridge. Maya moved slowly from panel to panel. The names weren't famous. Most had never appeared in history books. Many would have been forgotten entirely. Yet here they remained, preserved, remembered. The bridge was no longer simply a crossing. It had become a monument to ordinary people whose contributions quietly shaped the city. One official turned toward Elias. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" The old carpenter studied the river for several moments before answering. "When people build a city," he said softly, "they should be part of its memory." Nobody spoke after that. The statement needed no explanation. Over the following weeks, preparations began for the opening ceremony. News coverage expanded beyond the region. Visitors arrived to see the bridge. Historians became interested in the forgotten project. Local residents volunteered to help complete landscaping and final details around the site. Something unexpected was happening. The bridge was already doing what it had been designed to do decades earlier. It was bringing people together. For the first time in generations, residents from both neighborhoods worked side by side on a shared project. The atmosphere felt less like construction and more like reconciliation. Meanwhile, Elias continued spending long hours at the site, not supervising, finishing. There were always details left to complete. A railing adjustment, a carved panel, a protective finish. Tiny elements most people would never notice. Yet he approached each task with the same care he had shown 40 years earlier, perhaps because he understood something many people forgot. The final details often outlast everything else. The opening day arrived beneath clear autumn skies. Crowds filled both ends of the river. Families gathered along walkways. Local musicians played near the entrance. Children waved handmade banners. The city had expected a respectable turnout. Instead, thousands came. Many carried photographs of relatives whose names appeared within the bridge. Some had traveled long distances simply to witness the moment. As the ceremony began, speakers shared stories about community, perseverance, and history. Applause echoed across the water, but people kept glancing toward Elias, waiting, expecting. Surely the old carpenter would deliver the final speech. After all, the bridge existed because of him. Yet when his turn arrived, he quietly declined. No prepared remarks, no grand statement, no celebration of personal achievement. Instead, while attention focused elsewhere, Elias slipped away from the gathering. Maya noticed. Curious, she followed at a distance. The path led beneath the bridge itself, away from cameras, away from applause, away from the crowd. She eventually found him standing near one of the primary support columns. His weathered hand rested against the timber. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The river flowed quietly nearby. Footsteps overhead signaled the first residents crossing the bridge. Then Maya noticed something carved into the wood. The inscription was small, almost hidden. Impossible to see from a distance. She stepped closer. The words were simple. We said we'd finish it together. Below the inscription appeared two names, Thomas Hale, Elias Mercer. For a long moment, the old carpenter simply stood there, not smiling, not crying, just listening to the sounds above, the laughter, the conversations, the footsteps moving back and forth across the span. The bridge was finally alive. The promise had finally been kept. Maya looked up toward the deck overhead. People crossed continuously now. Neighbors greeting neighbors, children racing between families, strangers stopping to read the carved names. The city had gathered to celebrate a remarkable structure, but that wasn't what moved them most. What truly touched people was the realization that the bridge represented something increasingly rare, a promise honored long after. Outside the archive windows, rain began striking the glass. A distant roll of thunder crossed the city. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt the first real tug of a story. Not a construction project, not a retirement hobby, something older, something unfinished, something that had waited a very long time. And across town, as darkness settled over the riverfront, Elias Mercer locked his workshop and loaded several wooden templates into the back of his truck. Instead of driving home, he headed toward a fenced section of abandoned waterfront land that most residents had forgotten even existed. The rain fell harder, his headlights disappeared into the darkness, and by sunrise, fresh survey markings would appear on ground where no new construction had been approved in nearly 4 decades. The secret buried under the riverfront. The survey markings appeared overnight. By sunrise, people were already gathering behind the chain-link fence along the abandoned riverfront. The site had been untouched for decades. Most residents barely remembered it existed. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete. Rusted guardrails leaned toward the water. Old pilings stood like broken teeth along the riverbank, reminders of projects that had never been finished. Yet now bright orange stakes stretched across the property in straight, deliberate lines. Someone had measured everything. Someone knew exactly where each mark belonged, and everyone knew who that someone was. The rumors spread through the city faster than the morning traffic. By lunchtime, photos of the site had appeared on community pages. Local radio hosts debated theories. Retired construction workers stopped by to examine the markings for themselves. None of them could make sense of it. The layout was too large for a private project, too precise for a hobby, and too expensive for a man who worked alone. Meanwhile, Elias Mercer returned to his workshop and continued working as though none of the attention existed. The rhythmic sound of chisels echoed through the building. Sawdust gathered around his boots. The old radio on a shelf hummed softly between stations. Outside, people speculated. Inside, he kept building. Days later, the first major section arrived at the riverfront. It happened before dawn. Several flatbed trucks rolled through the gates carrying enormous timber assemblies wrapped beneath protective covers. Residents who happened to be awake watched from parked cars. By sunrise, cranes had begun lifting the structures into place. The shape emerging from the site only deepened the mystery. Massive curved beams, heavy support sections, complex joinery unlike anything seen in modern construction. People expected steel. Instead, they found craftsmanship.